Well, good morning and happy Sabbath. That was a good idea, Cecil. I appreciate that. I like singing with folks up front. Many of you know that I'm half Filipino, half Caucasian. But there's something about being Filipino that I do not completely relate with. Growing up with a mom who was full-blooded that came over from the Philippines, of course she brought a lot of that culture with her here to the States. And when she would have family or friends on over, there was always, in my opinion, too many people. All crowded within the house, all almost on just top of each other, all over the place. And that just made me so uncomfortable. Whenever my family, uncles, aunts, cousins would come over, we would literally take a 1,400 square foot house and fit about 35 to 40 people sleeping all over the floors and every place else. And that was just awkward and weird to me. Maybe some of the cultures that you've grown up in are similar in that regards, that you're willing and capable of doing that. I'm not similar in that the Caucasian part of me kicked in and I wanted my own bedroom. And I wanted my own bed. I didn't want to be around anybody. But my mom, always persisted in that. And she taught me a lot of lessons about hospitality. The whole Filipino culture is very much geared around that idea of hospitality, of serving and helping others out. Of course, there's a lot of flaws there, but the Scripture does lead us in this direction. Hebrews 13 and verse 2, if you're not already there, if you read with me once again, in the book of Hebrews, we're given this counsel: do not forget to entertain strangers, for by so doing, some have unwittingly entertained angels. Now, what's wonderful about the New Testament is that it always has some kind of reference to the Old Testament. It always boggled my mind when Christians would say, I'm a New Testament Christian. Really, there is no such thing. Either you're a Bible-believing Christian or you're not. Because the New Testament is so steeped in the Old Testament. It's so much grounded and rooted in the Old Testament. Take our scripture reading, for example. The writer of Hebrews had a particular story in mind when he spoke these words. And of course, there's a lesson, there's a moral here for us to understand. But as he was writing and as he was penning these words, there was an understanding, there was a story that he had in mind. And I'd like to turn with you to that story as we begin to talk about hospitality, as we begin to talk about the interest of others, the interest of strangers within our gates. This is what the writer of Hebrews had in mind. So Genesis, if you turn backwards with me to the book of Genesis in chapter 18, we have a story of some guests that show up at this man's doorstep. And I feel like I'm getting a lot of feedback or something with the mic. I don't see anybody up there. I don't know if that's the case. Can you hear me okay? Okay, if you can hear me okay, then it doesn't really matter too much what I'm hearing, as long as you can hear me. All right. Genesis 18, 1 through 8. And of course, this chapter is entitled The Son of Promise. This is the story the writer of Hebrews had in mind when he penned those words. Then the Lord appeared to him. Do you know who this is, by the way? Abraham, that's right. The Lord appeared to Abraham by the terebinth trees of Mamre, as he was sitting in the tent door in the heat of the day. So he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, 3 men were standing by him. And when he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them and bowed himself to the ground. So immediately we have this picture of Abraham who is waiting by the terebinth trees. By the way, those terebinth trees have a rooting kind of meaning within this story. Those terebinth trees are a place where significant things would happen. As you read through the rest of the Bible, those trees do appear once again. I can't get into too much of that right now, but just so that you understand. So he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, 3 men were standing there. So automatically, Abraham lifts up his eyes, and there are 3 guests right there. And when he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them and bowed himself to the ground and said, "My Lord, if I have now found favor in your sight, do not pass on by your servant." Now, this would be along those arid plains where it would be dangerous to travel alone or long distances by yourself without supplies. And Abraham recognizes this and sees these 3 men walking by themselves with nothing. They're walking with no water, no food, anything like that. And he hastens to go to them to make sure that they are taken care of, because he's concerned for them. "My Lord," he says, "if I have found favor in your sight, do not pass on by your servant. Please let a little water be brought and wash your feet and rest yourselves under the tree. And I will bring a morsel of bread that you may refresh your hearts. And after that you may pass by, inasmuch as you have come to your servant." They said to him, "Do as you have said." What a lesson we have here in treating those around us in the correct way. When we see people that are in need, it is important that we react. There are some tragic stories in our world, even in this past week, of people who did not react in the right way to situations that presented themselves to them. There are lives that are lost because of it. There are those who are shunned and outcast in society because of the wrong reaction to these individuals that need help. Abraham here sets an example for us in the correct way to react to those who we perceive that are in need. You know, we talk about the sin of omission. Do you know what that is? That's knowing what you have to do, but not doing it. It's just as bad as knowing the wrong thing to do and doing the wrong thing, is knowing the right thing to do and not doing the right thing. And certainly Abraham here is convicted the right thing to do is to take care of these individuals who are out in that arid plain and are in danger of not having food, not having water, not having supplies. He knows that if he was just to sit in his tent door and ignore them and just look out at the horizon and act like there's nobody there, nothing to worry about, I'm taken care of, who cares about these guys? He could have done that, but instead he engages them right away. To his credit, he engages them right away. As soon as he sees them, he is running towards them. He is going towards them and trying to figure out, what can I do to help these individuals? Now, let's take Abraham's example and consider our own lives. Consider those that are around you. Consider those that you come in contact with. Can you think of those that perhaps need your help? Can you think of those that could use encouragement, that could use something that maybe and perhaps you could provide? This is between you and the Lord. It's important for us to bring Scripture to that point, right? Because if Scripture is just all theology, if it's all just, doctrines and beliefs, then it really becomes pointless if it doesn't affect us personally. So think about your own life and those who you come in contact with. In our society, it's so easy to be caught up with our own selves, with our individual needs, with our future, with our supplies, with our safety, with this and that and the other thing, and to exclude the apparent needs of others around us. Here in the example of Abraham, we're given a man who reacts to the needs that he sees right away. There's not even hesitation in Abraham. Isn't that amazing? There's no hesitation. He runs and says, let me wash your feet, come here. If it pleases you, let me help you out. And they graciously accept his offer. And so we read on in the story. And Abraham ran to the herd, took a tender flock. Well, actually moved back to verse 6. So Abraham hurried into the tent to Sarah and said, "Quickly, make ready 3 measures of fine meal, knead it, and make cakes." And Abraham ran to the herd, took a tender and good calf, gave it to the young man, and he hastened to prepare it. So he took butter and milk and the calf, which he had prepared, and set it before them, and he stood by them under the tree as they ate. And, to Sarah's credit also, and to the servants' credits, they participated right away in helping out. Abraham had his house in order, and they participated right away in serving and taking care of these 3 men who had come into their midst. Now, there are many perspectives that we can look at this from. First off, let's look at it as a church body. We have to be very attentive to those that come into our congregation. We have to consider the needs of the congregation so that we are attentive to them. It's hard, and it's kind of a pastoral joke sometimes. When I talk to other pastors, when we see church signs that say, "The Loving Church," a lot of red flags go off in our head. If you have to advertise that you're a loving church, well, then that kind of, begs the question, are you really a loving church? What really stands out to pastors and to visitors is if you really are. I'm glad to say, every guest that I've run into that's come into our church says that we get along pretty well and we're loving. Of course, there can be improvements that can be made. But think about our congregation. Think about the way that we react to folks that come inside our church. It's important that we're not just congregating with those that we are comfortable with. Understand. We have to be willing to reach out to those that are uncomfortable in our midst and get to know them. Now, what does that mean? Well, there's an old acronym that we use in our training in school. It's FORT, F-O-R-T. What can you talk to people about? Whenever they've come and they're visiting, well, you can ask about FORT. Simple as this. Family. You ask about, hey, where are you from? Where's your family at? Do you have a wife? Do you have a husband? Do you have children, etc.? Are you visiting in town? Are you visiting your parents, etc.? Family is a very important thing to people's lives. Occupation. Now, this isn't very true for men especially. Occupation is something that we very much relate to as men. So asking, what do you do for a job? And, of course, then religion. Are you a Seventh-day Adventist? And the last one would be testimony, but that comes down to sharing, what the Lord has done in your own life. So those things help us out in relating and being a family and being part and parcel with them. It's important in a church setting, by the way, that people feel like they're part of the church family. Now, what really works is, for example, if you tell a joke, something like that, if it goes right over a guest's head, it's important that you explain what that joke really means, where it's coming from, the history and background. Families do this, that help to welcome and invite others. But those that are cold and indifferent will have all this inside joke and inside language that nobody else understands, and that can create kind of a cold environment. I can imagine as Abraham brought these guests in, he asked them, where they're from, where they're going. He wanted to understand their story and let them explain. Now, in order to be hospitable, in order to be understanding with folks, you do what your mother has always taught you. What did your mother always tell you about your 2 ears and your 1 mouth? Listen twice, speak once, right? Questions are your friend as you're trying to get to know guests in the church. Being hospitable means listening and understanding where an individual is coming from. And of course, the great moral of this story that carries over into so many other cultures and societies is the idea that when you're hospitable, there's a blessing that's in store. And what blessing did Abraham and Sarah receive from being hospitable to these three guests? What blessing did they receive? The promise of a son. That's right. Isaac would come as a blessing from this hospitality. So we don't be hospitable just to receive gifts and blessings, but as a result of being kind towards others, there is a blessing that's in store for us. And it's important to keep that in mind. So if you turn forward with me back into the New Testament, I'd like to look at a couple of texts that help us out with hospitality. 1 Peter, why don't we turn to 1 Peter together? 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 9. 1 Peter 4 and verse 9. And this is a short text that helps us with the understanding of what we're to be like. Actually, I'd like to back up to verse 7, as is my typical way of doing things with Scripture readings. 1 Peter 4, verse 7, and we'll work up to verse 9. But the end of all things is at hand. So immediately we have this world view, this world perspective that Christians should have, that this world is going to end. Therefore, be serious and watchful in your prayers. And above all things, have fervent love for one another, for love will cover a multitude of sins. And then verse 9, be hospitable to one another without grumbling. I remember an elder long ago that I'd met when I was first coming into the church. He read some counsel that we have in our church in regards to the end of time and the end of all things that are coming. He read that the worst persecutors in the church are going to be those that know us. The worst persecutors in the world are going to be those that actually know us, that are former Seventh-day Adventists. Well, you think about it, of course, that would make sense because they know the inner workings of the church, they know how the structure works, and they can really drive wedges and cause all kinds of problems within the church because they know who to point the finger at, etc., etc. Now, with that knowledge, that elder read that and he said to himself, oh my, the end of time is here. Everything's starting to fall apart. And so he decided that he would isolate himself and remove himself from the church books and go off to some other place. And, as he was leaving, he said, I don't want any of you to know anything about me because I think you're going to be the worst persecutors for me. Is that how we're to react? Is that how we're to react, knowing that the end of all things is at hand? Well, it's quite the opposite as to what this text is telling us. Above all things, have fervent love for one another. That tells me we need to press together as a church family. We need to love one another. And then verse 9, be hospitable to one another without grumbling. Now, that little caveat at the end of verse 9, without grumbling, so that you understand how important it was to do this without grumbling. In that time and day, Peter, Paul, all the rest of these apostles faced a lot of persecution. The challenges of the first and second century church were very difficult. Oftentimes when individuals would stand up for Jesus and would give their lives to Jesus, it meant that they were cut off from their families. So all they had was the church. So they had no choice but to help one another. And you can imagine how worse that would be if you had those who were helping that were grumbling and complaining. Oh no, another convert, I got to bring them in, and oh, I got to give them food and all the rest of it. That would be detrimental to the growth of the church. And so Peter gives that counsel in verse 9, be hospitable to one another without grumbling. Now, as we face the end of time, as our resources, as that time begins to press down upon us, and as things are cut off from us, our resources, etc., all that we will have in this world is Jesus and one another. And it's so important that we know how to treat one another. This right here is practice time for the real time that will be pressing down upon us. And in reality, of course, it's not just practice time. This is reality for us right now. But the decisions we make on how we treat one another now determines how we're going to treat one another in that time. You know, they have that old litmus test, if you will. If you really want to find out how a man is, you know, break his car or something like that, you know, and see how he reacts as he's driving down the road and his muffler falls off. How is he going to react? I remember an old story of three pastors that were driving down the road, and they were going to an important conference meeting, you know, that they had to be to. One was an evangelist, the other two were pastors. And as the car broke down on the side of the road, one of the pastors immediately jumped out and started working with the engine and dealing with the engine. The other pastor sat in that passenger seat and was just complaining. "Oh, no, I can't believe this happened. Oh, why is this happening to me? I can't believe this. We're going to be late. My appointment book is ruined. Now I've got to reschedule this and that and the other thing." And you know what the third pastor did? He prayed. The right reaction in that situation, of course, was to pray. We need one another to be able to help balance out those kind of issues that come up. This world is filled with challenges. But Peter tells us, verse 9, "Be hospitable to one another without grumbling." I'd like to move on to Ephesians. If you turn back with me to Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 7. Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 7. Yes, in our culture, and I pointed out some difference with the Filipino culture and my own culture, and I consider the American culture my own culture. There is such a difference even with that and the Middle East in the way that we view ourselves, by the way. Ephesians 6, and we're going to verse 7. But just to point this out as we get into this text here, we're so individualized here. Maybe some of you from other cultures would understand this, but the way that we identify in this culture is very much about me, about what I'm doing. Whereas in other cultures, the identity is all about family. It's all about a unit of individuals that work together with the same common goal, same common purpose. That was the case with Christianity back in the first century, where it wasn't just about me, it was about the church. And certainly, we're moving more towards that as we reach the end of time. But let's look at Ephesians 6, verse 7. This also gives us a perspective in how we go about our mission. With goodwill, once again, let's back up. Bondservants, verse 5, be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling in sincerity of heart as of Christ. Yes, there was slavery back in that day, but Paul even is telling the slaves to be obedient. Not with eye service as man-pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. And then we have verse 7, with goodwill, doing service. Now remember, Paul is here talking about these slaves, with goodwill, doing service as to the Lord and not to men. So there's a principle for us as we work, as we try and reach out to the souls that are lost in this world. We have to think about them as we are serving the Lord, as if the Lord has given us the command to take care of these individuals, that we do this as to serve Him and not just out of, wanting glory, as if you will, in this world. Now, it comes down to that idea of I once again. I want this. I want that. I need to succeed. I need, etc., etc., etc. There's such a different way of understanding and going about the mission that Jesus has laid out before us when we realize that we're serving Him. We are trying to do according to His will. And that perspective has to be part of what we push on in this life. That worldview, if you will, is something that we want to hold on to. So I'd like to turn back to one last text this morning, Hebrews 13, and then I'm going to share with you a little bit of an embarrassing story about myself. Hebrews 13, verse 16. Hebrews 13 and verse 16 also, the writer of Hebrews gives us this counsel. But do not forget, Hebrews 13, verse 16, do not forget to do good and to share. For with such sacrifices God is well pleased. When we're so engrossed in our life and just wanting everything for ourselves, and we forget that there are those that are in need that we are to share, that is a fallacy, and that's a blind spot that we really need to consider where God has led us in our life. In other words, if your life is all about you and what you need and what you deserve, then there's something that you've missed in the truth of the gospel. Do not forget, the counsel here is, to do good and to share. One of the stories that my mom used to tell, or she sometimes does tell about me, is when I was a little child. And as a child, of course, children are selfish. We would have friends over, and they'd bring their kids, and I would have my Legos out, or my G.I. Joes, or whatever it would be, and I'd be playing with them, and then my mom would force, as moms do, force me to share my toys with these strangers. Does that happen to any of you? Yeah, of course. Well, at that age, I didn't understand, so I started doing a little dance around these kids that were playing with my stuff. I would dance around them saying, mine, 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 mine. It was quite the show of me dancing around them, mine, 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 mine. That selfish mindset, as a child, can easily carry over into adulthood. What is mine is mine is mine is mine. When we clearly see about us in this world the needs of so many others. There'll come a time when this world is ending, when sincere Christians will have given everything to see the gospel completed. Because in the end, what really matters? Your bank accounts, your car, your house, all that stuff, are you going to bring it to heaven with you? No. What's going to matter is your character and those that you can bring with you. You're going to want to see saved everyone that you possibly can save in this world. We're not quite that mature yet, are we? We're not quite there. Just being honest. We can't hold ourselves up and say we're there right now. Yes, we want that. There's so much holding our hearts back. Part of that is our hospitality and with the way that we deal with individuals around us. Abraham sets that example for us in inviting those in and blessing them and receiving the blessing that they had in store for him. So this morning, I'd like you to think about in your own life, those that you have contact with. God knows and you know who you're in contact with, the persons that you have influence over, co-workers, students, friends, whoever they may be. What can you do this week to bless them? What can you do to share something with them that would benefit their experience with the Lord? It doesn't have to be a sermon, all right? It doesn't have to be thumping them over the head with the Bible. It can be something very simple to help them and to bless them in their experience. What can you do to be that Abraham this week? I'll leave that with you, between you and the Lord. And also, I want to insert just at the end here a tag for our potlucks, so that you understand the reason we have potlucks is not so that you'll gain weight. All right? That's not the purpose of potlucks. The purpose of potlucks is to give you that environment of fellowship with one another. Yes, it's wonderful to be able to eat. Yes, it's wonderful to be able to have good food and to spend time. But we want to be able to be an influence on one another and to have that Christian atmosphere. The benefit of that is so important for us. And I want to encourage you, and first of all, I want to applaud those that are so faithful in bringing food and participating and being here. Thank you so much. We appreciate that so much. For those of you that have not been so willing to do so, I really want to encourage you. You're missing out on the blessing of fellowship and being with your church family. I want to ask that you would take the time to do that. Now, I'm a hypocrite this morning because I got to run. I've got a wedding party that I've got to be a part of. I wish I could hang around and fellowship with you, but there's a wedding tomorrow and the family wants to spend time with me, get to know everything that's happening, etc. So I will miss you, but I want to encourage you to press together as a church family. You're more important to one another than you think. You need each other more than you think. We need that opportunity to share with one another. As we approach that end of time, I want to pray with you that you would commit your life to being the hospitable people that Jesus has called you to be. We all have room for improvement. No one here is perfect. Every one of us has made mistakes. But we need one another. Perfection doesn't come as a singularity. It comes as a plural. Do you understand? We do not become perfect as a people on our own. We become perfect together by pressing together in Christian love and fellowship. And I want to encourage that in our church. So with that, let's go ahead and sing our final hymn this morning.